Two versions of the same phone call are circulating right now in the Nolan Wells case. One of them has been obtained directly from a state agency, preserved with a verifiable digital record, and transcribed by a licensed forensic firm. The other has been shared, reposted, and treated online as though it contains a confession. According to the only digital forensics expert who has actually compared them side by side, the two recordings don't just sound different. They have different digital fingerprints entirely, which means, in the plainest terms available, that one of them is not simply an enhanced version of the other, it's a different file. Sit with that for a second because it's a stranger claim than it first sounds. We're not talking about two people disagreeing over what they think they hear in a garbled recording, the kind of ordinary human disagreement that happens constantly with noisy audio. We're talking about a forensic examiner running an actual technical comparison and finding that the underlying data itself, not just someone's interpretation of it, doesn't match between the two files people have been treating as the same recording at two different levels of clarity. That distinction between disagreeing about interpretation and discovering the files themselves don't match is the entire spine of what we're going to walk through today. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we're doing something a little different than usual. Instead of walking through a new development in the investigation itself, we're going to walk through exactly how a piece of audio evidence in this case became one of the most consequential examples of manufactured certainty we've seen in true crime coverage this year, how it's already destroyed one real person's peace of mind despite him having no connection to Nolan Wells' death, and what the actual forensic record says versus what a huge number of channels, some far less careful than we try to be, have told their audiences it says. If you've watched other videos on this case from other channels this week, there's a real chance you've already been told, with total confidence, that this recording proves something it hasn't been shown to prove. Before we get into the audio itself, a quick anchor for anyone catching this case for the first time. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a first-year wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, close with his mother, Christine Wells Wansley, and his father, Elmore Wansley. Those who knew him described someone easygoing, well-liked across different friend groups, the kind of person who cooked his mother dinner the night before a holiday trip. The ordinary, unremarkable details of a life that had no reason to expect it would end up at the center of a national news story a few weeks later. On July 4th, Nolan traveled out to Horn Island, a remote barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, with a large group of friends split across several boats, including one called the Triton. According to those friends, Nolan chose to stay behind on the island that afternoon rather than return with the group he'd arrived with. His parents have never accepted that account without serious reservation. Christine has said in interview after interview that she raised her son to leave with the people he came with, and that voluntarily staying behind on a remote, largely unfamiliar island doesn't match the young man she knew. She's also pointed to something that's gotten less attention than it probably deserves. The account of why Nolan stayed behind has, in her telling, shifted slightly across different retellings by different friends, small in each individual instance, but cumulatively enough to make her distrust the overall narrative. Nolan also didn't have his phone with him if he did in fact choose to remain, which raises its own obvious question about how he intended to get home. At around 4:31 that afternoon, the Triton left the island without him. 2 days later, on the morning of July 6th, his body was recovered from the water near the island's northwestern shore. The state medical examiner's office performed the initial autopsy. Those findings have never been made public and remain sealed pending a Jackson County grand jury. A second independent autopsy, commissioned by the family and performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr., listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined, citing key limitations including neck structures that had been retained by the state's office and were unavailable for his examination. Everything we're about to walk through today sits inside that larger, unresolved case, but it deserves its own careful treatment, because it spiraled into something with its own set of real victims, separate from the central question of what actually happened to Nolan on that island. Here is where the audio itself starts. At around 4 in the afternoon on July 4th, the boat carrying several of Nolan's friends, the Triton, began taking on water near the west tip of Horn Island. Its bilge pump had failed. Someone aboard called a private towing company, Sea Tow, for help. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the state agency that fields these kinds of maritime distress calls, retained a recording of that call, and weeks later, WLOX News in Mississippi obtained it directly from MDMR. That's the chain of custody worth holding on to. A state agency, a documented request, a named news outlet. In the actual recording, you can hear a teenager telling the CETO dispatcher, "Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come?" The dispatcher asks how serious it is. The teen responds, "It's coming up. We're just sinking. I don't know. We're going down, though." He confirms everyone aboard is present and in good health, provides GPS coordinates, and asks for a tow to the Fort Bayou launch. The dispatcher tries to transfer him to the boat's captain. The call appears to disconnect. CETO ultimately never towed the boat. That is the entire content of the original source-verified recording. A panicked call about a sinking boat. Nothing else. It's worth explaining briefly why this particular call became the center of so much attention in the first place, rather than fading into the background as a fairly ordinary piece of marine emergency radio traffic. Warren Hudson, one of Nolan's friends who was aboard the Triton that day, gave a separate later interview in which he referenced a friend by a nickname, saying something close to Bart before appearing to catch himself and switching to the word buddy. That moment, just a few seconds of a much longer interview, got clipped, replayed, and picked apart online as though it were a slip of the tongue revealing a hidden name investigators needed to know. Combined with the fact that a name resembling Bart would later surface again in a completely different and disputed piece of audio, that single clipped moment helped supercharge an entire theory before any forensic examination of the actual sinking boat recording had even taken place. We mention this not because the coincidence is meaningless. Two separate mentions of a similar name is the kind of detail that reasonably makes people curious, but because it illustrates exactly how thin a thread an entire viral narrative can hang from once people are primed to look for confirmation of something rather than test whether it's actually there. In the weeks that followed, a second version of this recording began circulating, one that had reportedly been processed by an independent audio engineer and then shared through TMZ. This version claimed to reveal additional voices in the background, phrases including, "Is he dead?" "You killed him," "Check his chest," "Nolan," and "Wake up." If real, those phrases would be about as close to direct evidence of a violent crime as this case has produced, the kind of thing that would justify every bit of the national attention this story has already received, and then some. They spread accordingly, across thousands of reaction videos, timeline breakdowns, and comment sections, treated by a large share of online true crime coverage as though they had already been confirmed, screenshotted and captioned with exclamation points, stitched into video after video without a single one of those videos pausing to ask where the enhanced file had actually come from. They have not been confirmed. What's actually happened since is one of the more rigorous pieces of independent forensic pushback we've seen attached to any viral true crime audio clip in recent memory, and it deserves far more attention than it's gotten. Digital forensics expert Robert B. Fried, Executive Vice President of Forensics and Chief Investigative Officer at a firm called Page One Incorporated, took on an independent comparison of the original MDMR recording against the enhanced version circulating through TMZ. He's not a random online commentator either. His analysis has been featured across back-to-back appearances on News Nation's Jesse Weber Live and in a panel discussion on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, specifically because networks wanted someone with actual forensic audio credentials weighing in, rather than more speculation stacked on top of speculation. Here's what his team actually did, described in his own words. "We extracted or preserved the videos from the specific websites," he explained, "and then what we were able to do there is take a digital fingerprint, an MD5 hash value, of those two videos." An MD5 hash is essentially a unique digital signature generated from a file's exact contents. Change even a single bit of data inside a file, and the hash value changes completely. It's the same basic technology banks and software companies use to verify that a downloaded file hasn't been corrupted or tampered with in transit. If the hash of the file you received doesn't match the hash of the original, something about that file is different, even if the difference isn't audible or visible to a casual listener. If two audio files share the same origin and one has simply been cleaned up, denoised, or amplified without altering its actual spoken content, you generally expect certain underlying characteristics to remain traceable back to a shared source, even if the hash values themselves differ due to the processing. Fried's team found something more fundamental than that. The files were, in his words, obviously different, meaning they contained different underlying content, not simply the same recording run through a noise filter. He didn't stop at the fingerprint comparison. His team also generated transcriptions from both recordings, running them through forensic audio software specifically designed to extract speech from distorted or degraded recordings. The kind of purpose-built tooling used in criminal investigations precisely because human ears are notoriously unreliable at parsing overlapping wind-distorted marine radio audio. Even accounting for how difficult that process is with a recording this noisy background wind, boat engine, multiple overlapping voices, his team's conclusion was direct. There was, in his words, nothing like that close to it in the transcriptions that we saw. Not, "Is he dead?" Not, "You killed him." Not the other phrases people have built entire theories around. His software, purpose-built for exactly this kind of forensic extraction, did not find them. Fried also raised a psychological point that we think matters as much as the technical findings, maybe more, because it explains why this spread the way it did, and because it's the kind of insight that applies well beyond just this one case to nearly any viral audio or video clip attached to a high-profile death. He said that once people are told specific words might be present in a recording, their minds tend to start perceiving those words whether or not they're actually there, a well-documented effect in auditory perception research generally, not something unique to this case. He was honest about experiencing this himself. "When I first heard about some of the words that were apparently heard," he said, "my mind was automatically going to that as well." That's not a minor admission. That's a trained forensic examiner acknowledging that even he had to consciously work to separate what he expected to hear from what the actual audio data supported, and it's exactly the mechanism by which a claim like this can spread even among people who aren't trying to deceive anyone. Once the phrase, "Is he dead?" is planted in your head before you press play, distorted background noise on a bad marine radio connection can start to sound like almost anything you're primed to listen for. There's one more wrinkle Fried pointed out that's gotten almost no attention. The original recording, the one MDMR released and WLOX obtained, was, according to his analysis, partially redacted, meaning portions of the file may have had information deliberately omitted before public release. In practice, government agencies redact audio and video records for a range of mundane reasons that have nothing to do with concealing wrongdoing, protecting the identity of a minor, removing a caller's personal contact information, complying with department policy on what portions of a 911 adjacent call can be released before an investigation concludes. We're not suggesting anything sinister is hidden in those redacted portions, and neither did Fried. His point was narrower and more careful than that. That neither version circulating publicly, not TMZ's enhanced clip, and not the officially released original, should be treated as a complete, unquestionable record of everything that was actually said on that call. Both have gaps. They're just different kinds of gaps, created by different processes, for what appear to be very different reasons. There's also a detail about the enhanced audio's own origin that tends to get dropped entirely once a clip goes viral. According to reporting on the audio engineer who processed the version TMZ eventually shared, that engineer explicitly asked for the recording to be used as, in their words, a listening reference, but not the only interpretation. That's a real documented caveat attached to the source of the clip itself, offered by the very person who created it, and it's almost never included when the clip gets reposted, clipped down, and captioned with a definitive claim about what it proves. An audio engineer telling you, up front, that their own processed file shouldn't be treated as the final word on what was said is about as clear a signal as you're going to get, that even the person behind the enhanced version understood its limitations better than most of the people who went on to share it again, and eventually build entire narrated videos treating it as proof. Ben Crump, the Wells family's attorney, has responded to all of this by announcing that his legal team has hired independent audio engineers to conduct a separate, full review of the CTO distress call, distinct from both the original MDMR release and TMZ's disputed enhanced version. That's a meaningful acknowledgement from the family's own legal team that the existing public versions, on both sides of this argument, haven't settled the question to their satisfaction either. A proper independent audio review of this kind typically involves obtaining the cleanest possible copy of the original source file, applying multiple different enhancement and noise reduction techniques rather than relying on a single processed version, and having more than one trained examiner independently review the results before any conclusion is drawn, precisely so that one person's expectation of what they might hear doesn't end up shaping what they report hearing. Crump's team has not yet released findings from that review, as of this recording. When they do, however it comes out, we'll be back to walk through it. That's an important detail for anyone tempted to treat this as a simple story of the family believes the scary version and the friend's side believes the boring version. The family's own legal team apparently isn't fully satisfied with either existing version, and neither, if his own statements are taken at face value, is the forensic audio expert whose analysis the friend's defenders have leaned on most heavily. Both sides, in other words, have reasons to want a clearer answer than either currently circulating file provides, which is a more complicated and more honest picture than the simple hero and villain framing most coverage of this specific audio dispute has settled into, and it's worth keeping that complexity in mind before deciding which side of this particular argument you trust. We want to pause here and talk about where all of this has actually landed, because it hasn't stayed confined to an abstract argument about audio fingerprints. It's landed specifically and heavily on a real person named Bart Edmiston. Edmiston is a former teammate of some of the young men who were on that boat. Online, self-described social media sleuths have named him directly as the person allegedly heard in the disputed enhanced audio, built entire theories around his supposed involvement, and, in the process, subjected him to exactly the kind of public accusation this channel's own standards exist to avoid making about anyone without official charges. His attorney, in comments to News Nation, pushed back directly and with specifics. He noted there are at least 20 people who can account for Edmiston's whereabouts that day. He also noted that Edmiston voluntarily allowed police to inspect his boat, his GPS data, and his phone without requiring a warrant, the kind of cooperation that is, generally speaking, not the behavior pattern investigators associate with someone actively concealing involvement in a crime. "You've got people who are in legitimate fear for their lives," his attorney said, describing the threats and harassment Edmiston's family has faced since his name started circulating attached to a piece of audio that a licensed forensic examiner couldn't even verify contains the words people claim to hear in it. Threats serious enough that they've required his family to speak to national media just to try to make them stop. We think Bart Edmiston's situation is the clearest possible illustration of the actual stakes here, more than any abstract debate about hash values and file integrity. A real person with no confirmed connection to Nolan Wells' death, beyond having once played on the same team as some of the young men involved, has had his name turned into a true crime plot point based on a recording that a forensic firm specifically retained to determine authenticity could not corroborate. That's not a hypothetical risk of online speculation. That's the actual, documented outcome of it, playing out in real time, to a person who isn't a public figure by any reasonable definition and never consented to becoming one. It's worth pausing on how quickly this specific kind of harm compounds once a name enters this ecosystem. Once a channel with a large audience says a name on camera in connection with a viral claim, that name becomes searchable, clippable, and repeatable across dozens of smaller channels within hours, each one adding their own speculative gloss, each repetition making the original, unverified claim feel more solid simply by virtue of how many places it now appears, a kind of manufactured consensus built entirely out of repetition rather than corroboration. By the time an attorney is explaining to a national outlet that 20 people can vouch for his client's whereabouts and that his client voluntarily handed over his boat, his GPS records, and his phone without so much as a warrant being necessary, the initial damage, the searches, the messages, the fear his family has described has typically already been done. Cooperation after the fact rarely travels as far or as fast as the original accusation did, and by the time it does catch up, a meaningful share of the audience that saw the original claim has already moved on to the next video, the correction never quite reaching everyone the accusation reached in the first place. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, one we've seen across a whole category of channels covering this case, not just one specific creator. A recurring feature of reaction and commentary content around Nolan Wells has been treating the disputed enhanced audio as the authenticated version and treating the original source-verified MDMR recording as the questionable one, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just through which version gets played first and which gets mentioned as an afterthought. That's precisely backwards from what the actual forensic chain of custody supports. The original recording has a documented path, captured by a state agency handling a real maritime distress call, requested and obtained by a named news outlet, available for anyone to request through the same public channels. The enhanced version's path is considerably murkier, processed by an unnamed independent audio engineer shared through a single outlet, and, according to the one forensic firm that's actually compared it against the source material, carrying a different digital fingerprint and content that couldn't be corroborated by transcription software built for exactly this kind of task. When a commentator tells their audience the enhanced version is indisputable, while dismissing questions about it as distraction, they're not offering analysis. They're reversing the actual evidentiary hierarchy and asking their audience to trust the reversal because it's delivered with confidence. That inversion matters beyond just this one case, because it points to something a little bigger about how chain of custody works in any forensic context, whether it's a boat call, a piece of DNA, or a photograph. The value of evidence isn't just in what it appears to show. It's in whether you can trace, step by step, where it came from, who's had access to it, and whether anything could have altered it along the way without your knowledge. A recording obtained directly from the government agency that fielded the original call, with a documented request and response, has a short, verifiable chain. A recording that arrives already enhanced by an unnamed party through a single media outlet with no available original source file for independent comparison has a chain with real gaps in it. Neither fact alone tells you what's true, but it does tell you which one deserves more scrutiny before being treated as settled, and it's the opposite of how a large share of this case's online coverage has actually treated the two files. This principle isn't unique to true crime coverage either, and it's worth remembering that the same standard applies just as much to us and to any channel covering this case responsibly as it does to the audio itself. Every time we cite a name, a quote, or a claim in an episode like this one, we're asking you to trust that we traced it back to something verifiable rather than simply repeating what sounded most compelling. We don't think we're above making mistakes in that process. We've corrected our own errors in prior episodes on this case, and we'll keep doing that whenever it's warranted. We do think the standard itself, trace the claim back to its source before repeating it, is the only thing that actually separates responsible coverage of an unresolved case from simply adding one more unverified voice to an already crowded and confused conversation. This channel has covered enough true crime cases at this point to recognize a pattern, and this case has become something close to a case study in it. Maybe the clearest one we've encountered in the roughly month and a half since Nolan Wells disappeared from that island. When an official investigation moves slowly, and when the reasons for that slowness, grand jury procedure, sealed autopsy findings, active threat investigations, aren't explained clearly or often enough to a public desperate for resolution, that silence gets filled. Sometimes it gets filled by careful outside experts trying to explain, in good faith, what the evidence can and cannot support. We covered that dynamic in a recent episode about forensic pathologist, Dr. Judy Melanick's actual hedged commentary on this case, and how her careful statement that certain findings may be consistent with manual strangulation, a conditional, cautious professional opinion, got flattened online into headlines claiming she had confirmed a cause of death she never actually confirmed. Sometimes the silence gets filled by fabricated documents built to look official, like the fake toxicology report Mississippi's own Department of Public Safety had to publicly call fraudulent just last week, with Commissioner Sean Tindell warning directly that fraudsters, AI, and social media are a recipe for disaster. And sometimes, as we've walked through today, it gets filled by an audio file whose actual forensic authenticity has never been established, treated online with the same confidence people would extend to a confirmed confession. Each of those threads is, on its own, a story about how a real tragedy generates its own secondary ecosystem of manufactured certainty. Taken together, they tell you something important about this specific case, and honestly about true crime coverage as a genre right now. The gap between what's actually been forensically verified and what's being presented to millions of viewers as settled fact has rarely been wider than it is here, and rarely has the human cost of that gap been more visible than it is in Bart Edmiston's case specifically. The consequences of that gap haven't stayed confined to one man's reputation either. In early August, 3 separate individuals across 3 separate states, Sacramento, California, a location in Ohio, and Berwyn, Illinois, were criminally charged for making threats against witnesses, family members, and officials connected to this investigation. One threat was directed specifically at Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, the mother of Warren Hudson, referencing violence explicitly enough that Cole has said she deactivated her personal social media accounts out of fear for her children's safety. Separately, the Hudson family has shared voicemails they say they've received since Nolan's death, one caller reportedly saying, "son for a son," another calling Warren's father the father of a murderer, another simply telling the family, "don't run now." It would be simplistic to draw a straight line from any single piece of disputed audio to any single one of those threats, but it would be equally dishonest to pretend the overall climate, an audio clip treated as confirmed evidence of murder, a name attached to it and repeated across hundreds of videos, a family's fear escalating in step with the confidence of the claims being made about them, has nothing to do with why threats serious enough to warrant federal and state criminal charges kept arriving throughout this case's coverage. 2 of Nolan's friends, Warren Hudson and Jax Patalo, launched a legal defense fundraiser in response to that pressure, which had grown past $160,000 by early August, according to public fundraising records, intended to fund their own legal protection and to pursue defamation claims against people they say have falsely implicated them online, a direct response to exactly the kind of unverified accusation this episode has spent most of its time examining. Their attorneys, J. Tyler Cox and Edward Andrew Paltzik, described their clients in a joint statement as 3 completely innocent young men, a characterization Ben Crump has publicly dismissed as a distraction from what actually matters to Nolan's family, which he said remains simply getting honest answers about how their son died, regardless of who's eventually shown to be responsible for what. Both sides in this dispute, notably, have now separately hired outside experts to bolster their version of events. Crump, with his own audio engineers, Hudson and Patalo, with attorneys explicitly focused on defamation. That's not, on its own, evidence of guilt or innocence on anyone's part. It's evidence that this case has fully transitioned from a grieving family's private tragedy into a fully lawyered, multi-front public dispute, playing out simultaneously in a Jackson County grand jury process and in the far less structured court of online opinion, where the rules of evidence that would govern an actual courtroom simply don't apply, and where a claim can be treated as proven the moment enough people repeat it with enough confidence. We want to be precise about what we are and are not saying, because precision is the entire point of this episode. We are not saying nothing happened to Nolan Wells beyond an accident. We are not saying his friend's account of that day is complete or beyond question. His own parents have said publicly and repeatedly that it doesn't add up to them, and we take that seriously. Christine has described in multiple interviews the specific details that trouble her most. That Nolan didn't have his phone, that the explanation for why he stayed behind has shifted slightly depending on who's telling it, that the timeline between the last confirmed sighting of him and his friend's departure still has real gaps in it that a separate United Cajun Navy report has attempted, carefully, to map. None of that is resolved by anything we've discussed today, and we're not claiming it is. What we are saying, based specifically on the one piece of independent forensic audio analysis that's actually been conducted here, is that the specific viral claim that an enhanced recording captures someone saying, "Is he dead?" or "You killed him," in the background of that CTO call, has not been forensically substantiated by the expert who's actually examined both files at the file integrity level. That doesn't mean those words are impossible. It means nobody with the technical tools to verify it has been able to confirm they're there, and at least one person's life has been meaningfully damaged by millions of people proceeding as though they already had been. The audio isn't the only piece of this case where confident-sounding analysis has outrun what the underlying method can actually support. TMZ separately brought in a body language expert, Susan Constantine, to review a televised interview Warren Hudson gave to podcast host Brandon Tatum. Her assessment, after watching a clip of Hudson insisting no one touched Nolan's phone, was that his demeanor in that specific moment indicated deception. To her credit, she was careful to frame it narrowly. She said this didn't mean she believed foul play was involved in Nolan's death, and that she assessed Hudson as telling the truth through most of the rest of the interview. That's a responsibly hedged, single-moment observation from someone whose profession is built on reading nonverbal cues. It's also worth being honest about what body language analysis actually is and isn't as a discipline, because it gets treated online with far more scientific authority than it currently holds. Unlike forensic audio comparison, which produces a verifiable digital artifact, a hash value, a waveform, a transcription anyone else could independently check, body language assessment is fundamentally an expert's subjective read of behavior, informed by training and experience, but not something that produces an independently reproducible result, the way Fried's file comparison does. That doesn't make it worthless. It makes it a different category of evidence entirely, one that should be labeled and weighted accordingly, rather than presented with the same case-closed certainty some coverage has given both the audio and the body language read alike. When a single hedged observation about one sentence in one interview becomes a video titled "Around Hudson Getting Caught in a Lie," the same flattening process we've described throughout this episode is happening again, just with a different kind of expert and a different piece of media. There's a broader question worth sitting with as we close this out, one that goes beyond Nolan Wells specifically, one that will keep mattering long after this particular grand jury reaches whatever conclusion it reaches. What actually counts as evidence in a case like this, when it's unfolding in real time, across dozens of channels, with new revelations landing daily, most of them impossible for an ordinary viewer to verify themselves? We'd argue the answer has to be something close to what Robert Fried actually did here. Preserve the original files, generate a verifiable digital fingerprint, run the audio through purpose-built forensic transcription tools, and report exactly what those tools do and don't find publicly in a way other experts could theoretically check his work against. That's slow. It's much less dramatic than a thumbnail claiming a phone call already proves murder. It also happens to be the only version of analysis in this entire case that's produced a result someone else could actually attempt to verify or challenge on its own technical merits. Rather than simply repeating a claim and hoping the confidence in your delivery does the convincing for you. Fried's involvement in this case hasn't been a one-off appearance either, which matters for how much weight to give his conclusions. Page 1, Incorporated, announced in a public release that Fried, who holds the title of Executive Vice President of Forensics and Chief Investigative Officer there, made back-to-back appearances on News Nation on consecutive days in late July before joining a broader panel of forensic and legal experts on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace days later, specifically to walk through the recently released audio recordings and the general role forensic evidence plays as investigations like this one unfold. That's a pattern of engagement built around explaining methodology to a general audience across multiple outlets, not a single soundbite delivered once and never revisited. And it's the kind of sustained scrutiny that tends to catch inconsistencies a one-time appearance wouldn't. It's worth knowing that context specifically, because so much of what's driven this case's spread online has been the opposite pattern. A single dramatic claim, made once, on one channel, and then simply repeated by everyone downstream, without anyone going back to check whether the original claim held up under any further scrutiny at all. We think that contrast points to something practically useful for anyone trying to follow a fast-moving case like this responsibly, on any platform, from any channel, including this one. When a claim about physical evidence, an audio recording, a photograph, a document, starts circulating, it's worth asking a short set of questions before treating it as settled. Where did this specific file actually come from, and can that origin be traced to a named source? Has anyone with relevant technical training actually compared it against an original, or is everyone simply reacting to the same processed clip? And if an expert's assessment is being cited, is it being cited with its actual hedges and limitations intact, or has maybe consistent with quietly become confirms, and has one hedged observation about one sentence quietly become caught in a lie? None of those questions require any special expertise to ask. They just require slowing down for the length of one extra search, which is considerably less exciting than a thumbnail promising a definitive answer, and considerably more likely to get you an honest one, even if that honest answer is simply, "We don't know yet." That slower, more careful approach is also, frankly, closer to how actual investigators are required to work, even when it frustrates a public that wants answers immediately. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath has said publicly that her office reviews every credible lead that comes in, and that professional conduct rules prevent her from discussing evidence while the investigation remains active, specifically because doing so could influence witnesses or compromise whatever comes next in the legal process. The pressure for answers does not change what the work requires, she said. We'd extend that same logic to how this channel tries to approach claims like the enhanced audio recording. The pressure to have a dramatic answer for our audience doesn't change what an honest account of the evidence actually requires either, even when the honest account is less satisfying than a confirmed confession would be. Nolan Wells' cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined. The state's autopsy findings remain sealed pending presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. No charges have been filed against anyone in connection with his death. The specific claim that an enhanced version of the CETO distress call captures evidence of violence has not been forensically corroborated by independent analysis, and a real person named in connection with that claim has, according to his attorney, cooperated fully with investigators and can account for his whereabouts through roughly 20 other people. If Ben Crump's independently commissioned audio review produces different findings than Fried's, we will bring that update to you directly, the same way we've tried to bring you everything else in this case, sourced, specific, and without pretending more certainty exists than the actual evidence supports. We think it's worth ending on Bart Edmiston rather than on the technical details, because he's the part of this story that's easiest to lose once the conversation shifts to hash values and transcription software. He didn't choose to be part of this case. He isn't a public official whose decisions are open to scrutiny, isn't a witness who volunteered a public account that invites cross-examination, isn't even one of the friends who was actually on the boat that day. He's someone whose name got attached to a piece of audio that a trained forensic examiner, using purpose-built tools, could not verify says what people claim it says. And that attachment alone was enough to bring threats serious enough that his family has had to speak to national media about them. Whatever the grand jury eventually decides about Nolan Wells' death, Bart Edmiston's ordeal will already be part of the permanent record of what this case cost people who had nothing to do with it. If there is a single concrete lesson this case has produced so far, independent of whatever the eventual sealed autopsy findings turn out to show, it might be this one. An unverified audio clip and a confident voiceover are not evidence, no matter how many times they get reposted, and the gap between those two things can cost a real person with no connection to a tragedy at all, more than most viewers watching from their phones will ever stop to consider. We'd rather be the channel that made you wait an extra day for that distinction than the one that handed you a false certainty and moved on to the next case before anyone had to answer for it. That's a slower way to build an audience, and it will never generate the kind of viral single video spike a confident false claim can produce overnight. We think it's the only honest way to do it, and we think over the long run, it's the only version of this channel worth watching. This has been Forensic Disconnect. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered.